just there's an issue. Treatment switching. I find this a fascinating one, and it's a really challenging one as to what to do about it. Quite often patients are allowed to switch from one treatment to another after disease progression. Now the estimates of progression-free survival won't be affected, that's fine. But it's going to lead probably to an underestimate of the difference in overall survival, because you've got patients who get the new treatment, but they just get it after the current treatment. And so that's going to close the gap in the survival curves. So you're no longer getting a good estimate of overall survival. So that's a challenge, but there's things we can be done. Here's an example. This was crizotinib. So this was just a few months ago, or last year actually. Crizotinib for previously treated ALK-positive cancer. 87% of the control arm in the main trial, profile 1007, 87% crossed over to crizotinib. And if you didn't adjust the hazard ratio, so you didn't allow for crossover, the estimated hazard ratio was 0.854, with a confidence interval actually quite either side of 1. If you adjusted for crossover, if you recognise that 87% of the control arm subsequently got crizotinib and adjusted for that, you get a new hazard ratio of 0.38, and it is statistically significant. So it's a very real problem. But the challenge again is there's different ways of adjusting for crossover, and some will make a bigger adjustment than others. Which is right? And then, is it finally? No, probably not. Indirect treatment comparison. So this was a case of nivolumab, and we wanted to see a comparison of nivolumab against nintedanib and docetaxel, and possibly nivolumab against best supportive care. But the trial we had, called Checkmate 57, was nivolumab against docetaxel. So you're forced to identify a network of treatments, and by being able to compare the nivolumab docetaxel treatment effect, we could compare it with the nintedanib docetaxel against docetaxel treatment effect. Now that sounds so straightforward, but that will only work well if the patients in the docetaxel arm of Checkmate 57 are similar to the patients in the docetaxel arm of this thing called LUM-Lung-1, another trial. And frequently, they aren't similar. And so it's a real challenge. Then you've got to estimate your quality adjusted life years. I can skip this quite quickly because we've had questions, I've answered some of them on this. There's different ways of making the adjustment. There's EQ5D, there's SF6D, there's do you use a value from the trial, or do you use something in the literature, or might you possibly map? And again, they'll give you different answers. These are just examples, you don't need this, but these are the range of values. Remember where it's progression-free or progressed disease. It's the same health state again and again in all of these, but the numbers vary quite a lot. And they vary quite a lot, sometimes because it's a different measure being used, but sometimes it's the same measure, but it comes from a different trial. And so which is the right answer? Is there a right answer? Then you've got to compare costs. That was just to get your qualities. You've got to compare costs. Now you think this should be the easy bit, but it isn't really easy, because the first thing you need to know is what quantity of drug will be used. Now the quantity of drug will depend on two main things: how long it is before someone progresses, and on are they experiencing toxicities, adverse events, and therefore might they stop treatment sooner? Or might they cut the dose, adjust the dose? And so that introduces uncertainty as to how much drug will be used. Now that matters because a major driver of the cost is how much of the new drug you're using. Another problem, this is not a problem for the committee because we get to see the information, but most drugs, the unit cost is confidential because a deal has been done, a secret deal on the price. And so how does a manufacturer making a case for its product, how does it know how to cost its rival's product if the rival's drug was a comparator? So huge challenges. Right, so I've just got a couple of slides observation. I'll make them very quick. I haven't emphasized that you have to choose the right comparators. Depending what you compare your drug to, you get a different answer. So that's a big issue, but I haven't had time to go into that. But the greatest challenge in this area is convincing modelling of survival. You've usually got maybe just one trial, and it may not be a very large trial. The patients may not be quite similar to the patients that you expect in routine practice. I think it is also the case we need to make a bit more progress on how we measure health state utility values. That is, how we weight the time people spend in different health states. But I hope, although I've highlighted problems, I hope you've got the idea that it is quite possible to dig into the clinical effectiveness evidence, add an economic aspect to it, and come up with information that's potentially useful. But it is challenging, and it's particularly challenging because for the committee, it's an issue of, right, we want to make the best use of public money. For the industry, it's we want to sell our drug. Now those views are not sort of diametrically opposed, but they're not in alignment. There's a competing issue there. And at the same time, you've got a world out there of patients, patient groups, and clinicians who all want you to say yes. And I think that's my last slide. Let's find out if it is. Hey, it is. So, any questions? Comments? Apologies for squeezing a lot into a little space. But it's to give you the sort of flavour of the issues. Yes, please.
I have a question about the utility in the post-progression state. I have been referred to the one study in Japan. They study the utility in the breast cancer patient, and they have the different value for the maybe 6 months before that, and 6 months after progression. So they have different values. So what is the exactly time point we should evaluate that?
Yes, that's a good question. Most trials stop collecting data when the patient progresses. So the estimate of the progressed health state post-progression, this estimate frequently is collected at the last time, or if you like, the first time they decided progression had happened. But of course, the nature of progression is, when it first happens, it can be quite subtle. When it first happens, it doesn't mean suddenly your health state plummets. It's coming down. But as you get nearer death, it can get really quite low. And so that is a challenge. What some studies have done, here's an example. They've looked at time from death and are allowing a different score, because of course after the event, once people have died, we can work backwards. That observation was so long before death, so far away. So what they've allowed for here is health state values that vary by time from death. But that's not very common, and the general problem is that we just don't collect, for obvious reasons, we don't collect a lot of data from patients who've progressed. Because of course it's a bit intrusive. Mind you, the EQ5D, or indeed SF6D, you're not asking a lot of the time of the patient. It's not really too demanding, but at the same time, one can understand why studies frequently, once a patient progresses, they stop collecting data. In fact, sometimes they stop even collecting survival data, which I think is wrong. Yeah. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I'm agreeing with you, it's a real problem, and the problem is lack of data, and the data we have is probably overstating, giving too high a score for the progressed disease state, usually. Yes?
In the UK, patient access schemes are provided for only cancer drugs or other drugs as well?
Other drugs as well. A patient access scheme is a sort of, usually a price cut, or something, it's effectively a price cut. It's been most common with cancer drugs, but it's also the case there have been patient access schemes with respect to some other drugs as well. Yeah. Just a word on that. Manufacturers have been fairly willing to offer confidential price cuts. And there's two reasons. One, the UK is quite a big market, so it's the NHS, 60 million people, so it's quite a big market, so that's attractive to them. And two, the promise of confidentiality. Because if the price remains confidential, the only price that people know about outside of the inner circle, as it were, is what's called the list price, the official headline price. And quite a few countries practice, and certainly Japan was doing so, I'm not sure if it's still doing, a sort of form of reference pricing where you look at prices elsewhere, and that is part of sometimes a formula which helps you set a price. And of course, it's in the manufacturer's interest that countries are using high prices as the reference and not the actual confidential discounted price. Okay, well, let me say two things. One, you may have thoughts or ideas or something after the event. All these lectures had my email address at the start of them, so do feel free to contact me. I will respond. I can't say it would be helpful or what. That's the one thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say was to thank you for your attentiveness and your willingness to ask questions and engage in a discussion and make comments. Because I said this right at the outset, I think, I do realise, one, it's just tiring to sit listening to people. It is. It's incredibly tiring. And the second one is, for some of you, or maybe all of you, I don't know, but certainly most of you, English, of course, is not a first language, which makes it doubly tiring. So I want to thank you for your participation, and I do hope it's been a good use of your time, because I certainly feel it's been a good use of my time. Thank you.